I think one thing I didn't mention is, what I said about the end of Hollywood in the late 90s, sort of a delayed end of history than the Fukuyaman end of history, so the end of Hollywood history. It coincided also with the birth of digital film watching. So what happens is, so there's been a lot of writing about what is lost with digital film. So basically, the idea that you have in film, you have like a semiotic, a real imprint of the real. So it's a photographic memory of something that was there, whereas a digital photography is a human algorithm that imitates cameras. So it has lost this connection to the real world. It's basically binary codes, how we imagine a camera is. And I think that has a lot to do with how serious people take film. And there have been studies about how much people are invested in cinematic films made on film, cinematic films shown digitally, and cinematic films filmed digitally. And there's a great difference between art house films that are shown digitally or filmed digitally or are made digitally, and the emotional investment in digital projection is completely different than emotional investment in filmic projection.
It's Alpha Bunga Bunga, and it's Oscars time. What does this have to do with the end of history? We're going to find out shortly. Alpha Bunga Bunga today is myself, Alex Hochuli, George Hoare in London, and Ben Fogel in Sao Paulo. Also joining us, a return guest, Maren Thom, who teaches film at the Queen Mary of the University of London, to talk us through how Hollywood has cancelled itself. You may have noticed that many institutions in today's world are desperate to seem relevant. How has this affected Hollywood's output, and how does this affect film criticism in turn? You may have noticed a certain boneheaded literalism in a lot of film criticism. We're going to explore all this. But before I hand over to George, remember to check out our Patreon at patreon.com/bungacast. Donate if you like what we're doing, it'll help us grow and expand. And also please drop us a review on iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts, and also on Facebook. That's all, on with the show. George, take it away.
Yeah. Thanks. Action. Maren, last year, listeners who were with us at that point heard you give your opinion on The Shape of Water as the worst film of the year, the sort of film that a male feminist would make. What was the worst film of this year? Or are you still so annoyed about Shape of Water you want to give it another kicking?
I've tried to sort of put it into my subconscious and not think about it. And the good thing is, I didn't have to, because I don't think it became very successful. People didn't watch it. It didn't become a thing afterwards, after the Oscars. It has not been talked about. Didn't come up anymore. So, yeah.
There weren't even many fish fucking memes. I don't know. I didn't see
Not
any.
at all. It died after the Oscars. And probably thanks to my review, but also, but I think also because, as you know, the last year's Oscars was the lowest viewing figures of all time for the Oscars, 2018. And, Trump famously tweeted, Oscars are so irrelevant. As usual, he was probably right, but as usually he's a pig and wrote like a pig about it on Twitter. So, I've made it a point of not watching bad films because I don't have that much money and I have a life. But I did have a lot of I did watch a lot of movies this year, and I had a good time in the cinema this year. But I did manage to watch bad films by accident. So I went to see Ocean's 8 by accident. That was a mistake. So
what was the nature of the accident that led to this? Did you just fall into the wrong cinema?
Yeah. Basically, no. My friend, I have got different friends with whom I watch different films with, and I've got one friend, my Blockbuster friend, and she said, "Let's go to the cinema." And I just go, "Yeah, why not?" And the only thing that was on was Ocean's 8, and I thought, "Oh, how bad can it be? Come on!" And yeah, no, it was really bad. But basically, what was bad about a film, and a good criteria for bad films, is that they don't deliver. So I know it was basically, a switch around film where they switched all the male roles with female roles. I thought, oh, okay, I'm ready for this. But what I wanted is a good heist film, and they didn't deliver. It was predictable. It was boring, had bad performances. So I thought, it's not even a good heist film.
On that note, what did you make of Widows? Because that description that you just gave, some people might apply to that film as well. Yeah,
but on the other hand, Widows, it wasn't a good heist film, but it was a beautiful film, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it had qualities that were bigger than its subject matter, which I think that made up for it. So I really like all Steve McQueen films. I think Steve McQueen is a great filmmaker. I don't think the substance goes beyond it, but he's really an accomplished visual storyteller. And I think this is why I really liked it.
Knows how to frame a shot.
Ocean's 8 seemed particularly a new level of cynicism, but it's the remake of a remake, which you don't just swap roles. You don't really have to even write a new script. So it's kind of very cheap and unoriginal and certified to make some money. So it's like a no risk, no effort film.
No risk, no effort, and usually you have, for example, the Ghostbusters movie, the switch around remake. So you had a really weak script, but you had actresses who made up for it because they were improvisers. So you can throw shitty lines at them, and they will make it funny. So Mr. McCarthy and Kim McKinnon and so on, they can just make anything funny. And you don't have that with Ocean's 8 because you've got serious movies actors and they need good writing and good script to be actually good. And if they don't have that, it's basically a stone. And then you've got Rihanna in this as well as a kind of an entity. I can't really call it an actress, but
Rihanna of Battleship fame.
So, but basically the idea that a bad film is a film that doesn't deliver what you expect it to. So, for example, I went also to see the Harry Potter one with the Crimes of Grindelwald. I went to see that with my nieces, and their only desire to go and see the movies is to watch cute animals. And I think that's a really good reason to go and watch a movie. And so they were really disappointed that film didn't have any fantastic beasts in it. And I thought, yeah, that's a good criticism. Apart from the plot holes and the craziness and the bad acting and the bad writing, the fact that there are no fantastic beasts in it is the best criticism of this bad movie.
Well, and if you want to talk about being undercut by new media, cute animals, you've got the internet coming in pretty strong there. You don't need to go to the cinema to see cute animals. There's loads of them on the internet. I don't know if you've noticed. There's cats and otters, all sorts of animals. So cinema has a real sort of challenge there on its hands.
Yes, I know. But you want it to be a collective experience at some point. You want to experience cute animals with other people,
but not actually have to go to a zoo.
We did that afterwards to make up for that disappointing experience.
So speaking of classifying films into groups, we were looking through the Oscar nominations, and they seem, maybe this is just my impression, but abnormally concentrated in quite a small number of films. And the main, best film, best director nominations, if I could be really crude, you could classify them as music films and black or racism films. Would that be fair? And actually, there's one or two in which the categories even overlap, so you kind of have You have a bit of both. You have racism and music.
Racism and music, I think, yeah. So music is always a good one with Hollywood, because Hollywood, one of the criteria of Hollywood films is always that they love to make stories about themselves. So films about performance that are also musicals will always be a big hit. And so, as I said before, the idea that the Oscars strive for relevancy is a big subject. So I don't know if you remember, they tried to introduce a new category in August.
No, tell us about this.
Yeah. So fiasco last. It's not just last year. So the viewing figures of the Oscars, if we want to take that as an indicator of their relevancy, they've been going down steadily since the beginning of the millennium. So, the Oscar viewing figures were quite steady till about 1990, 97, 98, and then they dropped in 1998. So maybe what you can say is that, when Fukuyama predicted the end of history, what also set in was the end of Hollywood cinema, but just a bit delayed. So what you have is, if you look at, for example, all the Oscar winners until sort of 1997, these were all Oscar films that you remember. So it's like Forrest Gump and Silence of the Lambs, Oscar films that you would, they have a traditional Oscar feel to them. So it was the usual story of the underdog or a historical figure that overcomes oppression and strife. And these kind of films were sort of real good, what you would associate with an Oscar film, like a worthy film. But on the other hand, they also were big hits at the box office. So there was an overlap between their popularity in viewing and outside in the cinema, and the critical acclaim they had at the Oscars. And that peaked absolutely in 1997. Do you know which film won the Oscar in 1997?
Titanic.
Titanic, absolutely. So Titanic just broke all the records, and it still has. So it was technically, artistically, it was right out there. It was, boundary pushing, and people loved it. And everybody went to see it. From 9 to 90, everybody watched Titanic. And then something happened. The rot of postmodernism set in. That's what I would call it. So after it was Shakespeare in Love, and already nobody watched that. And then steadily, if you go through all the past Oscar winners, the viewing figures were really, really wobbly. And what is most interesting is that the discrepancy between the films that won and the viewing figures in the cinema go far, far apart. So the only sort of convergence was again sort of 2003 with The Return of the King, sort of the last of the Lord of the Rings films, and so the last of the big cinemas where public taste and critical taste sort of overlapped. But from then on, honestly, what the people watched and the films that got Oscar nominated were completely different worlds. And so maybe you can say that there's some, let's say, overlap or some similarity going on in the institution of Hollywood in the same way that all the other institutions went through this kind of post-political loss of meaning and connection with the people, so to speak. So they have lost purpose, they've lost meaning, they don't know how.
So where does that leave us today with the Oscars in 2019? Because I think that's a really interesting trajectory.
Yeah.
What do they mean today? Are they just at the floundering at the end of history? End
of history.
Don't mock us.
No, I mean, it's the good thing is I can say this and everybody will know what I mean. If I told this to anybody else, they would just go, "What the fuck?"
You're allowed to do end-offs. You can have the end of the end of. That's it. Maximum of 2.
Oh God. No, but what we have at the moment in Hollywood is this need for legitimacy that you find in politics and all other institutions that have been, I don't know, academically and intellectually lazy for the past 20 years. And they try, as all other institutions, they try and fill it with narratives of, I don't know, inclusivity and diversity and relevance. How do we make ourselves relevant? Yeah, we have to be more inclusive. We have to be more diverse. So, basically using, a completely weird answer to a weird problem. So, and this is why I think, as you say, there were so many black films in there. Rather than, I don't want to be cynical, but I'm probably even more cynical than you, because Black Panther was, the second highest grossing film last year. So everybody watched Black Panther. So rather than actually having it as a black token film in there, I think it's a populist token move. So, and as I said, I don't know, coming back to the beginning of what I wanted to say, that they wanted to introduce a new category in August, and that is most popular film. So
wow.
so they dropped that, but so the whole purpose of a kind of industry defined award would have been gone. It would be like the MTV Film Awards or so, MTV Video Awards, where the public vote for their most favorite film. So they wanted to have the category of most popular film. So
I think another aspect to this, I think also the other interesting development this year was the fact that streaming platforms were simultaneously putting big budget award category films out as they were going on the cinema. And this has undercut some of the elements of going to the cinema if you can just stream it at home. And I think there's also a bit of a responsiveness about need to make sure that films that attracted people need to be included. Because I think this streaming platform and the fact that some of these films were nominated is something which is also new.
Yes, I think last year the Mudbound that was nominated, which was a Netflix movie, and last year it was nominated for Best Cinematography, which is interesting because it was a Netflix movie. And the Netflix movie that is nominated this year is Roma, which is, if not pure cinematography, it lives off it. And I don't personally have a problem with having a cinematic experience on a small screen. I think you can have because it worked for me. Well, when I watched Roma, I thought, this is great. I can do this. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I watched Roma last night and felt the same. That it's like there's something missing here because it's obviously not a plot-driven film, so you kind of need something a little bit grander to wow you, at least, and the cinematography's there and it's beautiful. And I was like, kind of maybe wish I'd watched this in the cinema. I didn't have the option to, and then I went and read some reviews and they all picked up on this. So I guess it makes sense in that case. I actually think the films which most surprised me and which I liked, I really liked The Favorite, and also that was because of the cinematography. Because I think a lot of the content and the plot of a lot of the kind of main Oscar-nominated films are pretty obvious and often terrible. And so the ones which I appreciated were the ones which I appreciated for technical aspects more than for, the kind of content, if you can call it that.
Absolutely. I think you're right with The Favorite, which I also think was great because of its cinematic aspects. To me, it looked like a Stanley Kubrick film from sort of 1972. Yeah. I was just ruined for me by the performances, which I didn't like at all. So I had the discrepancy between, I like looking at it, but as soon as people were on it, I just
well, we discussed separately about disliking the overexposed Olivia Colman, though I did think she was fantastic in that. So.
Oh, right, yeah. I because I have to think, because I do a lot of acting teaching, and therefore I am always really interested in what works and what doesn't, and why does she not work for me, but everybody else seems to love her, and I think, no, it's just awful. But I'm happy to say that that there's probably horses for courses with this one. But I also liked if we want to talk about controversial performances, Rami Malek in Bohemian Rhapsody, everybody I talked to, oh no, that's a horribly tacky performance. I loved it. I thought there was, the Bohemian Rhapsody as a film didn't quite work for me, but the performance of it, him as Freddie Mercury, I thought was fantastic because it was over the top. It was a performance, and it was unreal, and it was not methody. So I thought, this is kind of the kind of OTT-ness that I want from a Freddie Mercury representation, something that is in itself not real, so something that is performative. And this is why the film in itself clashed for me, because it was really tame, really tame story of Queen. I thought they could really have pushed the boat out with that one.
Well, I mean, you're obviously put yourself very clearly in the position, you advocate the position that, it's horses for courses. It's what you expect from a film. You want it to at least provide what it promises and, not undersell and so on. But to move on to the more political matter, I guess, in terms of something which maybe you don't want, I'm going to pass on to Ben here.
Well, of course, 2018 was a year of political disasters and setbacks mostly. And a lot of our commentary of this year was sort of in the culture wars. And I think more so than even previous presidents, Trump has become sort of a singular figure in American and international culture wars. And the Academy has definitely tried to intervene, as well as many filmmakers, in this culture war by selecting films which had something to say about Trump. For instance, Black Klansman, explicitly at the end of the film, one of the films nominated, Spike Lee, ends with a sort of montage in Charlottesville, which is definitely trying to make a point about Trump and the subject matter of the film. Is this a year in which Trump has come to dominate not only, it seems, our collective unconscious, but our attempts to escapism by going to the cinema?
I think you can say yes, because obviously, he's actually in some of the movies. So he's in Black Klansman, and he's also in Vice. If you remember, he's in the end. They've cut him into that. So the films are definitely Trumpian. You could, even The Favorite. It's about despotism. There's a clear link there. A Star is Born, escapism. So, and I think the kind of, because I really like Black Klansman, although, as we all know, it's about as subtle as a sledgehammer. And, why do I like Black Klansman and I didn't like, what's it called, the water film from last year? See, it's already, The Shape of Water. See, it's already sort of nicely,
I really
nicely gone.
I really didn't like it.
I loved it. I thought because, as I say, like Shape of Water, it is, it wears its politics on its sleeve. But why did Black Klansman work for me and Shape of Water didn't? Because Black Klansman is a good film. It's so, a film as an art object has to be bigger than the politics of the filmmaker, which Shape of Water wasn't. It was all the kind of cinematic language and performances only served to hammer down the points that the filmmaker wanted to make, the metaphors, the visuals, the music. Whereas Black Klansman, was far bigger than that. It was a really good script writing. It was very funny, and I was really into it. I thought in the end, oh my God, they've got to find out who he is. And so I was really into it. And I think that's because Spike Lee, despite being probably a big dick, he's actually a really good filmmaker, and he knows how to create tension.
To be. He's had a lot of stinkers recently. I mean, he's made some great ones, but there's been a lot of awful films he's made over the last few years. So this is like, I mean, the thing that pissed me off so much about Black Klansman, and maybe this is just because I kind of am a historian, is that it completely gets the historical context wrong. Because if you were to watch the film, you would think it's set in the early 70s. But in actual fact, the events and the rise of David Duke occurs in the late 80s. So you have juxtaposed the tail end of the civil rights struggle, the emergence of Black power radicalism in a different context to what David Duke was doing. In this case, you have George Wallace was actually the figure in this period rather than David Duke, and suddenly you have like all these different historical facts jumbled together. So if you're trying to unpack the historical context of what actually happened in these events, you've got a complete jumble. I mean, it was entertaining, but in terms of like what it was trying to do, it was one of those films that takes too many historical liberties to really make a serious political point about the context.
Well, it's the type of film which also really shouldn't be taking historical liberties, you know.
Yeah.
Historians against anachronistic films. Yeah. It's not a pedantic point at all. It's important.
But what you're really talking about in this context is the 70s is a period of the rise of the new right and Reaganism, which had this sort of like on the side, the attempts of David Duke and others to make certain racist aspects after the civil rights movement mainstream again, using a different language. And in this case, you've got like the height of these violent fouls in the early 70s, which is a completely different thing. So it's like these two contexts are like water and oil. One doesn't happen without the other in terms of the process.
Yeah. So I know, but I don't care because it's a film, and because Spike Lee uses it. You know, you can mix time lines, scales for whatever works, and he makes it work. This is why it works, because he doesn't. He's not a slave to history, which is what film is about. So if you go to films for history lessons, I think you might be on. You can look forever and you will not find a satisfying experience. I think watch it for what it is and enjoy, because it's really funny.
Well, so that might actually work as a nice segue onto a question which I wanted to ask you, because I guess we're seeing a lot of woke film criticism, ones which take films to task for representing the wrong sort of values or for characterizing the human experience in a way which they find it doesn't fit with the way that they think things should be. So I wanted to discuss that also in light of kind of Trump, because is it possibly the fact that a lot of kind of this form of woke criticism, which has a bit of a history over the past decade or so, actually now kind of bearing fruit in terms of the object of its critique. That is to say, like, films are now kind of seeking to respond to that and incorporate that. We can think maybe about Me Too as one example of that. Or in terms of racial representation in films and so on.
So as I said, if we are at the end of history, and basically the creative classes are the classes that are at a loss to find any connection with people. And as you can see from Black Klansmen, their answer is that, the people are, Trump voters, and they've always been, because the institutions are racist. So Spike Lee is a Black Lives Matter guy, so don't forget that. And he will, read history backwards, like they all do, to serve this kind of worldview where the solution to this political deadlock that we're in is nicer politics. And, a nice president. Obama, nice guy. Politics doesn't matter. As long as the person is nice, their politics will be nice. Trump is a pig. Politics, probably quite similar to Obama's, but because he's not a nice guy, he's a bad president. He's MAGA. He's racism. And so their answer to this is the same as any institution will, has decided for itself to make itself relevant to the people, by being inclusive, by by being representative. And with cinema, it's even more literal, because it actually literally represents things. So it shows things. So the necessity for, this kind of the liberal middle classes and their answer to political problems in representation lies within things like cinema. So it has to literally represent their politics. That then becomes the politics.
But I think that's what irks so much about these battles over representation in film, is it's precisely the crudeness of it, because it's not that listen, Hollywood hasn't paid enough attention to certain stories, and they've, for example, only portrayed black people in a certain negative light, and actually they should be telling other stories which exist. Okay, cool. I'm fine with that. That's actually a very valid critique. The problem is it's precisely in the literalism of it that it has to, in any context, be, have a one-to-one, very literal representation, count up the numbers, are there an equal number of women and men, and so on. And it's like, that's absurd. The world doesn't look like that. So you're actually doing a disservice to the world by not representing it.
Yeah.
I think there's another issue here as well. That, in fact, Hollywood doesn't do political films really well. It's the exception that any of them turn out half decent, because it's so literal-minded. And the second thing is, like, for instance, Hollywood cannot do anti-war films at all. If anyone's actually think of it, like all the anti-war films I can remember, or supposed ones, for instance, are like Vietnam parables in which Americans are the real victims. So you can never get around certain political points in Hollywood. It's precisely the ability to not make certain films people are worried about losing sponsors or markets, and that makes it so bloody literal-minded, and that's boring.
It's also with the war point, Ben, that war on film looks pretty dramatic. It's quite, it's quite a cinematic, quite an easy thing to make, quite spectacular.
Yeah, so what's more fun, war or anti-war?
Exactly. If you're trying to show the horrors of war, you just end up with a very gripping, potentially quite horrible film, but one that's still a spectacle.
Take Saving Private Ryan. The first 20 minutes are like probably one of the best sequences ever recorded of war, but the rest of the film is terrible. It's this awful story about like
more war.
This one dude, which makes no sense, which is the worst sort of like Spielberg soppiness. But yet, no one really remembers how bad the rest of the film was, because the first 20 minutes were good enough to make everyone forget about the rest.
I like Steven Spielberg. I think he's really good. Yeah. But I think the idea of trying to find your history in cinema is prone to failure, and that goes for historians as well as millennials who want to redo history, through cinema, make it right. And so there's because of what you were saying at the beginning, the idea of trying to fix the world through these kind of casting and writing decisions very much coincides with a generation that has been brought up with a kind of film criticism that understands film through a kind of cinematic language that is comes from film studies courses which teach Laura Mulvey, and this is how objects are created on film through the gaze, and it depends who looks at whom in what way and who is being shown more dominantly in this way. And so, you get all these kind of film students analyzing who is in the foreground and who is looking at whom, and then constructing a kind of ideological answer out of this. And you just go, no, it's actually not in there. It's a weird way of reading film. But this is, this has fed a whole sort of generation of people, and they will then read film in these kind of really narrow ways. So what has happened is that there's a really narrow reading of film as art. That's what happened. And everybody is doing critical analysis. And as you know, 99% of critical analysis is really shit. Yeah, so it's terrible. So, and because they want to do this, they leave out any kind of artistic merit and artistic language and artistic features that you should look at first. So the kind of pre-ideological thing that film is, I'm probably being.
Sorry, are you saying that they critics take film too seriously and at the same time maybe not seriously enough?
Yeah.
What is exactly the problem? Is it that they don't treat it as art first and foremost and then examine its technical and aesthetic qualities first? Or is it that they try to put too much importance on the meaning of the film, or the more contextual aspects or the politics of the film, what it represents, and so on?
I think you have a big trend of this, especially with loads of online sort of film criticism. And you can see that old film critics are being constantly pushed to analyze films in terms of how they represent and in what way they represent through casting and film directors. So there's a constant line in there somewhere, oh, by the way, there's not enough women in it. Or by the way, the representation of this is terrible. So there's a big big school of film criticism. That's probably the most dominant one, which looks at the ideological role of this film. Is it, does it do this? Does it do that? Rather than looking at, is it something that is, what are the criteria of art, let's say. So one of the main criteria of art, is it bigger than its own dimensions? So is it greater than the parameters in which it works? Has it got more ideas in it?
Just to move on to some of the specific films that we wanted to chat about. One of them, and it as you were saying that, it made me think of Green Book. So this is I thought this was an interesting film because there were some, very many problems with it, but it had two quite compelling performances in it, and the two main leads. So what do you think this film tells us, if anything, about, I don't know, to put it a bit grandly, the status of the actor in contemporary cinema? Because you mentioned earlier you do a lot of acting teaching. What can our listeners learn from watching this film about good or bad or great acting?
I've not seen much of Green Book. I must say I've only watched half of it. I'm sorry, but
which half did you leave early or arrive late?
No, I've got it on my computer, and I only watched the first half. I just thought, I'll guess the second half. No,
I mean, it is one of those films where you can totally guess the second half, and yet, I wanted to hate it. I think it's a film which I most wanted to dislike.
Exactly.
And I loved it, and I enjoyed it, and I was like, oh, hugs, and I hated myself for feeling that way. But it's.
And do you know why? Because I think that is the most traditional Hollywood film that's on the list. That is going straight back to the 90s, but with a digital camera. It has got it has the same narrative, writing,
redemptive elements, and
redemption, moral arc, and like a typical Hollywood film. And this is why it works.
Yeah, with just about enough surprises to keep you on your toes. I mean, it more or less exactly happens as you would expect it to. And there's just one or two little moments where you're like, nice. But it's just fodder. But it's so well executed. I mean, particularly in terms of the two lead actors, that you kind of go, well, that's good. I mean, it's not grand art, but in a kind of very middlebrow sense, it's decent.
Yeah, thing is, it works. The thing is, I think we come very rarely across films that work anymore, that have got a beginning, a middle, and an end, that are sort of traditionally structured, and you just go, this is what it's like.
So it also has Viggo Mortensen's Italian-American accent, which is pretty good. But there's a one thing which it does, and Alex, I think you hit the nail on the head. This was a film that I really wanted to dislike, but I couldn't. I couldn't find it in me, that source of hate. But I guess the question is good acting relatively less important when you have relatively more blockbusters featuring characters like superheroes that don't need to be acted? Are there cultural differences in what good acting is? Because it's quite striking that you actually see a film that has a big performance in it, and you actually think this isn't completely overblown, quite kind of pantomime acting.
I think there's two things. The first thing is that there's a massive difference between acting and performance, and people get these things confused all the time. So acting is a skill. So it's the skill to be so much in control of your body that you can emote a different humanity that is not your own quite spontaneously. And that you have to be able to, that's a profession. And then you have to do it with other people as well. Whereas a performance is basically everything around, it's basically doing that in a play or in a film. So whatever is good acting, there's the old saying that even a donkey is a great actor in a film because everything else has to work with it. So The Rock is a fantastic actor because he works in these kind of parameters.
I agree with that. The Rock is a great actor.
Yes,
The Rock is.
He can't make a bad film.
Like Arnold Schwarzenegger, great. Yeah. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger as well. Great actor. He was a character actor. So when he's put in his correct role, like Conan the Barbarian, Total Recall, True Lies, he kills his role. He does what he's supposed to do. The Terminator, and you can't fault him. Well, it's like, well, I think Joe Pesci's the greatest actor of all time. I mean, come on. Anyone can roll Joe Pesci role better than that.
So I just have to make a quick point on Skyscraper, which is a fantastic film.
Absolutely, I agree. As I said, I had a good time this year at the cinema. There was a lot of good films. And a year where you can watch The Meg in the cinema, that's a good year for cinema.
Good shark films is good. I haven't seen one since Deep Blue Sea.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Sorry, you're making this point about acting against performers. Is there a general shift in the balance between the two in cinema? Is that the...
I think... it's always a really interesting one, and the trends change. So, for example, if you look at Roma, these people are not actors, but they are really good and really watchable. Yeah, so they're now actors because they've been in a film, so you have to call it acting. But so I've been looking at the history of acting and what people thought is good acting. And so from sort of from the turn of the century, when you had actors like Sarah Bernhardt, and people thought she was wonderful. But if you would see her perform today, you would just go, "What the fuck is this?" It's like really bizarre way of acting where nobody would recognize this. And the same, throughout the ages. So even till the 1950s, if you watch like a play from the 1950s with like big names, even Larry Oliver at the National, you would just go, "Oh, this looks a bit stiff, doesn't it?" But people thought he was brilliant. It's like the best actor in the world. And even today, you have got, as you say, Joe Pesci or so. And what?
Can we talk about acting? Let's talk about Vice, which is another film which I think was quite interesting because it relied on the Christian Bale, who of course goes over the top in many of his performances for his role. In this case, I think there's two interesting things. One is Christian Bale's performance of what is supposed to be a singularly unlikable man in Dick Cheney, and the extent of what the sort of like method acting means today, which I'm not sure how in fashion it is. And secondly, I think the other thing about Vice, which I quite appreciated, even if I had problems with some aspects of the film, is that it uses the springboard of the degeneracy and nihilism of the Nixon years, in which people like Roger Stone and others who became key to the Trump campaign later, as the springboard for its commentary on politics, which is something which is kind of interesting to say the least.
Can I just continue with the other question?
Yes,
please?
go for it.
Because you asked me what is good acting. And so, we all experience these kind of different performances. And what they all have in common, they interviewed loads of people and you think, why do you think these are good actors? And they all say, oh yeah, they're so realistic. So good acting has to be an experience of truth. So you think somebody's a good actor if you experience truth. So, and for me, this is why over the top non-method stuff is really good acting, because I find that in the sort of clownish abstraction, I think there's a greater truth. So I see a lot of truth in this. Lots of people like not to see any acting. So they like to see a really naturalist translation of this kind of what they want, what they hear and what they see. There are definitely cultural differences in what people think is good acting. Yeah. So what do you experience as truth? And I think my preference for kind of overt performances has a lot to do with, first of all, I come from the theater. Secondly, I like modernist performances. And thirdly, I'm European. So I've got a language thing that makes me want to, I always find this kind of directness truthful. This is why I like the Bohemian Rhapsody performance. It's grotesque, and to me, it's really truthful. Coming to Vice, which I thought was great. It was like an Adam Curtis film as a film. So I thought it was a great story. And so Christian Bale doing his, eating a few burgers there. I thought it was really nice, and making this horrible man accessible in a way. I don't know if it would have worked if he hadn't been so grotesque. He had to not be Christian Bale. I think you needed that makeup to not see Christian Bale, and I think that really worked. Sometimes, that was really good makeup.
Isn't there a danger of with Christian Bale's case is just him gaining or losing a lot of weight, because that's all he really seems to do nowadays. In Machinist, he sheds tons and then he just puts it on. It reminds me of there's an anecdote of when they were doing Marathon Man. Laurence Olivier and Dustin Hoffman had that scene, and basically Dustin Hoffman stayed up all night and ran around Central Park, I think it was, at 3 a.m. so that he would look like he'd been up all night and he'd be sweating. And then Laurence Olivier was like, "Why did you do that?" And then Hoffman was like, "Oh, to make my performance like as authentic as possible." And Olivier was like, "Well, why don't you just act?" So
there you go. You've got two different acting styles, which have different purposes, and they tell different kinds of truth. You can see this kind of sort of 1950s English theatre style and American method acting really well in A Streetcar Named Desire, when you've got this famous scene between Marlon Brando and Vivien Leigh, who plays the Southern Belle, and Marlon Brando plays this kind of laborer, and she has this. And here the two very contrasting acting styles support the kind of character and the truth that these characters tell. Yeah, so you've got really different bizarre. Why do you think they hire all these English guys to be bad guys in American Hollywood films?
Because they're under the misconception that all English people are evil.
No. I tell you why. Well, they are evil, but although English and American are probably, are very much the same language, but they do perform differently. So there's always a duplicity in English, that you don't take, that they don't mean what they say. There's a duplicity. It's fake. Whereas you don't have that in American. I know, but it's true. But this is why it works. And so in American, you don't have this. It's a very much wearing your heart on your sleeve. There's no hiding, and it's very straightforward.
Yeah, I like that. I like that point.
Yes. So there's this is why you cast certain people for certain roles. Casting is storytelling. Joss Whedon famously said this. So not everybody can act anything. You have to cast the right person for the job, and you cannot outact the role. So you cannot hire any actor to play any role. It just doesn't work. You have to cast right.
Right, and that cuts very much against the grain of a lot of, well, I guess what we've just called woke film criticism. There might be a better way to characterize that. But another aspect of this same sort of trajectory in film criticism is something that I referred to very briefly earlier, but which I found I ended up writing a review, or I guess what you could call a counter review, if that such a thing exists, of First Man, the Damien Chazelle film about a biopic of Neil Armstrong, where there was a very well-known reviewer who took the film to task for representing a very repressed version of masculinity, which didn't fit in with our therapeutic conception of the self that we have today. And it didn't feel like a very 60s film. It didn't feel like 60s and groovy in the way that he felt it should. In fact, it felt very 50s and repressed. And it's like, well, the guy's an astronaut who has to reach the highest levels of self-discipline possible to achieve something completely new, completely almost impossible. in the eyes of previous generations. So, depicting that and depicting that sense of self-domination, I think, was a completely appropriate thing to do. And of course, this is very typical of Damien Chazelle. I mean, it's one of the things he loves to focus on perseverance and determination. And somehow the fact that offended contemporary sensibilities, rather than that being something interesting about the film, it was taken as something on which to criticize the film for. That it failed to represent the way that we feel people should be, which is an oddly moralistic sort of requirement to impose on a film, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that speaks for a lot of film criticism at the moment, that it didn't make me feel right. Yeah. So the film made me feel wrong, and this is why it's bad. So, and as you say, I thought First Man was my film highlight of the year. It was fantastic. It was a great, because it worked very much as a cinematic experience. It was, as you know, film people like to say, it's affective. It makes you feel things. So you sit there and you're this rattling rocket, and you just go, and the music and the visuals and the camera, it makes you feel afraid, and it makes you feel triumphant, and it makes you feel brave. And these are, and I came out feeling triumphant, brave, and forward looking, and these are things that are really frowned upon almost today. You're not allowed to feel these things. And so I can understand that many people came out of this feeling, oh my God, I don't like this. It makes me feel, it makes me feel things. So, it makes you feel not the right things. It makes you feel,
Well, and he didn't have, there wasn't enough of a personal backstory. There wasn't enough of him emoting over the death of his daughter, even though it does demonstrate that he feels that loss quite acutely, because he doesn't demonstrate that in the, emotionally correct fashion. Then it's criticized, and it's a bit like there's also the right sorts of, you can feel brave, but it has to relate to some personal overcoming. It can't be in relation to some external conquest, because that's too, like old style Western films, that's something that's really frowned upon. It's seen as ipso facto colonialist, which is an odd way of treating these.
We're coming back to the kind of idea of representation and the kind of film criticism people have grown up with, this kind of the postmodern notion that you have to tell the backstory to justify, to justify the characters, to tell their story, their life. So what Zizek calls in filling in the gaps. So in modernist storytelling, you just get the story and you have to fill in the background with your own imagination. So it's a kind of subjective void that you have to work at. So, but the postmodern film criticism is, no, it's going to be shown to you by the film. It helps, these stories have to be told. So, for example, in the latest the Picture of Dorian Gray film that was in the cinema. So they showed the backstory of Dorian Gray and his psychologically abused by the father and the reasons why he's become a maniac. So, but it's not in the book, because that's what makes him a monster. You don't know. But the modern urge the postmodernist urge is to fill this in. And this is why, from the same guy who criticized First Man, he criticized Roma as well, for not showing the backstory of Chloe, the server.
Wow.
And
I watched this film last night, and that's something that you obviously infer. I mean, she speaks her native tongue with the other fellow employee in the household. I mean, you can kind of surmise these things. It's I guess this is another example of that kind of boneheaded literalism in a lot of criticism today.
It's a Philistine world that and you have to really fight it. And so the idea that, her story is not shown, we just see her in relation to her employers. We don't see her as a full person. So people have come up with this expectancy of being told the stories of other people. Every story has to be told and to be shown. And coming back to a kind of film analysis where the gaze is the determinant of storytelling, and you just go, it just doesn't work in the real world.
Do you think this is also partly because people are less willing to accept structures in general in the abstract. So things like economic structures as determining of characters. So you have to have an entirely spelt out biographical trajectory because people are less willing to accept social types as actors.
Probably, but I think they do love their types. The types work. There's a reason why there are stereotypes, because they work, and you use them as a cipher in film, and you just are only allowed to use the right ones. Or in the 90s when it still worked, you could use them in a postmodern way, but you can't. The postmodern irony that you had is completely lost. You cannot. Many people won't get that you're doing a reference to something, or that you are explaining something through something else. So there's a real fear of there's a real fear of subtlety, a real fear of leaving subjective gaps of meaning in things, because Nazis could come and fill it in with their horrible ideology. And this is why this is the logic of Spike Lee in Klansman. Because there was a kind of a gap of meaning, and who came? The Nazis came back and put MAGA hats on everybody. So you have to fill in the gaps of history, otherwise you're not in control of it.
You have to spell it out, or somebody else will spell it out for you.
Exactly.
Right. So talking about spelling it out.
You don't. Yes.
So talking about spelling it out, let's move on to the final section here. I do want to talk about what we thought were our best films this year as a way of wrapping up. I've already said my bit about First Man, which I think was mine. I'll come back to Maren at the end in case she wants to add anything other than First Man. Ben, first of all, what was your favorite film this year?
Well, I had two. My first one is The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which I thought was another Coen Brothers masterpiece. It's, again, one of those films which doesn't offer any easy answers. It's at times absolutely ridiculous and utterly depressing. It's brutal. It doesn't really have it doesn't fill in the gaps for you. It's just one of those really effective pieces of filmmaking for me that left me with this. This is kind of why I like to watch films. I thought, in particular, from its sort of cartoonish first sequence with Buster Scruggs, the aforementioned character, singing his way to heaven, to these sort of absurdist piece of violence, or this every main character gets killed, to Tom Waits, who really proves he can actually act in his sequence, which was amazing. The other film which I quite enjoyed, which is a more left of center, is a film called Mandy, which is kind of, the best way to describe it is if you let David Lynch make a metal music video in the 1980s starring a heavily drugged up Nick Cage and casting the villains as a bunch of psychotic hippies, which is always a good character casting for me. It's just absolutely bizarre. It's completely ridiculous and doesn't take itself too seriously, and is definitely worth watching. It's also something which is dark and ridiculous, which I just don't see something that's effectively put up like this anymore very, very often. It feels like one of those weird movies that came out in the 70s or late 80s that kind of becomes a cult classic, but it's kind of in 2018. I would highly recommend people watch it, especially if they, I think Nicolas Cage is actually a good actor. He's just had to play himself in a lot of very bad films because he spent all his money on castles and tigers.
Definitely second Mandy, and I think you're absolutely right. It does feel like this is some weird cult film. Why are they re-releasing this for the 25th anniversary? No, it's got Nick Cage. It's modern day. But my favourite film was probably a film that for most of it was quite boring. If anybody's seen Wild Pear Tree, listeners or anybody in this conversation, without giving anything away, it's quite a dull, slow, very slow film that makes you think a little bit about what it is to experience boredom in the cinema. Also, Enter the Void and Love by Gaspar Noé made me think about this as well. But then it just all turns on this extraordinary final sequence, which I obviously won't give anything away. And then it makes you think about the whole of the rest of the film. And it did make me realise that you can spend over 3 hours in a cinema and most of it you just want to check your phone, but then there's a high point, and then you remember that film for the whole of that year as being the best one. So go and check it out, anybody who hasn't seen it. But stay till the end. Don't leave after 2 hours 45 minutes, because it's still got something to give.
That's our big takeaway. Stay till the end.
Stay till the end, folks. It's the same with
Don't check your phone.
It's the same with podcasts, right? You know, you've got to keep keep going to
the best stuff's often at the end. Yeah, it takes a while to warm up, and then you get there, and then you explode onto the scene in the last 20 minutes, and it's put in a hell of a performance.
So, Maren, what about you? Well,
I must say, again, First Man, because it was quite, it was one of these cinematic things where you just feel, and you don't have to really think about stuff, which is nice. That's why I like to go to it. But it makes you feel interesting things, and it makes you feel stuff that you don't want to feel, and it makes you feel. I like the story, and because I've got a personal interest in American space exploration, so I really liked that one. I liked a German film that was called In den Gängen, so In the Aisles. If you want to check that out, it's a very sweet film. And yeah, I must say I did like Black Klansman. I thought it was just a well-made film. I'm really sorry. It was good. Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of fun in the cinema this year. So there was lots of fun films on. I enjoyed Mission Impossible this year. I always liked Tom Cruise. I think, people talking about bad acting. I mean, he's not a bad actor, but put a camera on that man, he delivers. That is just worthwhile, just having him in front of the camera. It's just
Magnolia
worth all the money.
Great performances, because basically he's playing himself. Him jumping on the couch before he jumped on the couch.
Yeah, so I like him. I just think some people just work in front of the camera. The camera, this old saying, the camera loves them. The camera loves them. There's something ethereal that you cannot actually buy or put your finger on, and this exists. And I think this is one of the beauties of cinema. There's some sort of real magic there.
I think with Tom Cruise, it's because of his organs. He's got really good organ levels. So,
all right. So, last shout before we close this off, Maren. What's going to be the big controversy of the Oscars?
Hasn't it already happened? In that they cancelled they wanted to cancel the transmission of Best Cinematography and Best Editing and some other technical awards, which they already took back, but the
the controversial thing will end up being that the Oscars are against their own art form, which
basically that they've cancelled themselves. So the Oscars have actually cancelled themselves out of relevance by trying to be so relevant. I think it's a beautiful example of, if you want to try to be relevant, and how much out of touch the creating classes are. Yeah, in the same way any kind of liberal classes are in terms of grasping what's actually going on and how out of touch they are. This is a beautiful example. I mean, it wasn't so tragic. It would be funny.
That's great. That might be a good point to finish on. The Oscars are auto-cancelled. Maren, thanks very much for joining us to talk about film once again.
Anytime.
Cheers.